All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Leftovers presented by the Back to the Bible broadcast. These are short little episodes where we are diving deeper into material from previous episodes of the Back to the Bible broadcast that we did not get a chance to go into. So this is just something that we're doing throughout the week to make sure that we are being productive, that we're putting out material so as to keep individuals engaged and to help people be able to further deal with argumentation, be able to better defend biblical positions. And as we're going to be dealing with more on the topic of wine, alcoholic beverages, strong drink, and what the Bible has to say about it, this is episode 4, and unfermented wine, so easy a caveman could do it. You might be saying to yourself, well, how do we get from episode 2 over here to episode 4? That's where you need to stay subscribed and hit that notification bell on the Back to the Bible broadcast YouTube channel, because we actually did an upload on Tuesday where we took the last 13 minutes of episode 19, where Jordan and I were live discussing John chapter 2, wine at the wedding feast at Canaan. And we took that and just made it into its own little leftovers episode for people to be able to share. It's easy to listen to, maybe for people that are not wanting to go all the way through the hour and 13-minute broadcast, which we certainly hope that people would do that, because we've put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, and trying to make sure we put in as much good information there as we possibly can. So for today's episode, we're dealing with some questions, some arguments that we commonly run into as we're dealing with this topic of Bible and the wine issue. And these were actually some arguments that got presented to us just recently from some folks in the community and those that just are watching throughout the nation. So the argument usually goes like this. Well, Micah, there's no refrigeration during Bible times. So without there being any refrigeration in the Bible times, how would they be able to keep grape juice from fermenting? And they even bring up the point. Wine ferments naturally on its own without adding anything to it, no yeast being added. And we agree to that, okay, there is no refrigeration in the Bible times, and that in fact, yes, if you leave wine alone long enough, that it will in fact start to ferment and become alcoholic. But just because those points may be the case does not then prove the conclusion that is then brought from these from these arguments. Therefore, it could be used at the Passover meal if it was in fact leavened or fermented. And even taking that a step further and saying that, yes, it could even be involved or used on the Lord's Supper table as we are partaking of the Lord's Supper today, which is unleavened bread, which is very interesting to me how that when it comes to the unleavened bread aspect, they have no issue understanding that when Jesus says, or when God says that this is supposed to be unleavened bread, okay, this is unleavened bread, there's no changing that. But yet when it comes to the wine aspect, we want to start trying to make excuses. And as well, if you want to do this, that's fine. They really weren't going to be able to preserve their grape juice anyway so as to keep it from being unfermented. So therefore, it's okay if we do it here. But friends, all of this falls flat on its face when we really start considering what is behind this. And what's behind this is that we just simply have people wanting to make excuses for what God has said. God said very clearly, you do not involve yourself in these practices. Does alcohol have its purpose? Yes, it can be used for medicine. But even then, when we're discussing alcohol, I believe there's at least four, maybe 5 different kinds of alcohol that we actually have in our world. And each one is very different from the other. So when we're discussing alcohol and its uses, we need to qualify even further what it is that we're dealing with. But even when it comes down to that, when God says you need to stay away from something, don't look at it, don't consider it, then we do not need to start playing this game of, well, what about, this or that? If God says stay away from it, you just simply need to stay away from it. But we have too much going on in our society where, well, people are wanting to get involved with it, so how are we supposed to hold them back? You show them from the scriptures that this is what God has said on it, either they're going to do it or they're not. And if they won't, then you don't have to keep company with them. You don't have to keep them around so as to be involved with them. You just simply say, okay, this is how you're going to live, I'm not going to be around. I'm not going to involve myself in these type of practices. So let's look at this first argument that individuals want to throw out. Well, there's no refrigeration in the first century. Granted, but refrigeration is not the only means of preserving. Refrigeration as we have it, I believe the first refrigerator was made in 1805, maybe 1810. So that is a fairly new invention and a fairly new concept that we have just with it being within our country. So how was it going on? And even then, you don't have to go back to Bible days. Just go back to colonial days when people were coming over here in wooden ships trying to make a new start. How were they able to preserve food? Colonial Americans employed a variety of effective food preservation techniques, many of them dating back to ancient times. And ancient times would include Bible times. Those are the Romans, Greeks, first century Jews, and even going back into the Old Testament. What would they do? Salting, smoking, and potting were most often used for meats. Pickling, drying, and cold basement cellar storage for eggs, vegetables, and fruits. So even here in the United States, they did have a means by which they were able to keep things cool so as to preserve them. All right, we'll dig a basement. We'll have a cellar, and that's where we're going to store our eggs, vegetables, and fruits. So right here, if people just use some common sense in realizing, okay, not that long ago in our country's history, this is how we were actually preserving things, even down to preserving meat. Meat spoils very quickly. But yet our ancestors here in the United States, they were able to preserve meat because they salted it, smoked it, or potted it. But then you want to turn around, so they can preserve meat, but then you want to turn around and say, yeah, but when it came to preserving grape juice, they just couldn't figure that sucker out. Come on now. Let's get serious here. If this is what they were able to do with meat, then what about grape juice? They were able to preserve their grape juice. Part of the problem, too, that we have going on throughout the religious world is that we want to look back on the Bible people, Bible characters, as though they're just, like pictured here, just dunce. They're dense. They're not knowledgeable. They were not smart individuals. And thus, many in the religious world, they actually think that cavemen were a real thing. There's no such thing as cavemen. We have the record of creation. God created man and woman, Adam and Eve, and from them created a whole host of population until the time frame of Noah, in which God then judged the world, and he punished the world, and the only ones that were left were Noah, his wife, and 3 sons and their wives. And then they repopulated the earth. There were no cavemen. So we have an evolutionist idea, evolutionist theory that's crept into the religious world to where many have bought into this idea. Well, yeah, they were just cavemen walking around on their knuckles, grunting at each other and beating each other over the head with clubs. But a quick read in Genesis chapter 4. So this is Adam and Eve. They've had Cain and Abel, and Seth has now come into the picture. And this is the family line of Cain. Now, we're going to read this, and I'm asking you, does this sound like cavemen to you? As to all the things that they were able to accomplish. And Ada bare Jabal, he was the father of such as dwell in tents and of such as have cattle. So he's a herdsman. And he's able to travel around with cows. And if you know any ranchers today, they'll tell you, keeping up with cows, keeping up with cattle is not an easy thing. That's not an easy job. You have to know what you're doing. That doesn't sound like a caveman to me. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all such as handle the harp and organ. So not only do we have ranchers, but we have individuals that are making instruments of music. So you're telling me that they could create a musical instrument and actually play music on that musical instrument, but they cannot preserve grape juice. And Zillah, she also bare Tubal-Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron, and the sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah. When it discusses here, he's an artificer in brass and iron. He's making pots, he's making vessels, but not only is he doing that, but he's making weapons of war. He'd be making swords, spears, shields. This doesn't sound like cavemen to me. These are individuals that they're able to talk, they're able to write. I mean, if they're making music, and we have some in the religious world that would say, well, writing actually did not come about until, somewhere around a little bit before Moses' time. They don't know their Bible very well. Because here are individuals way before the flood, thousands of years before the flood, and look, they're making musical instruments and they're making music. I don't know if you've ever picked up a music book or ever tried to write a song. That's not an easy feat. That's not an easy thing to do. And then not only that, you take into consideration Noah building the ark. And here's an individual that had never seen rain. And then God says to him, build this ark of a, massive design and massive dimensions. And he's able to do it. Now, some might look at that and say, well, God gave him the instructions. Well, God gave him the instructions, but Noah had to know how to do it. You can give me the instructions on how to build the ark, and I can guarantee you it's not going to come out looking like the ark was supposed to look like. Because that's no easy feat. We do not need to start looking at these Bible characters as though they're ignorant, stupid, backwards people. They know what they're doing. And they're able to figure these things out. I mean, even so, going back to our, here in the United States, our grandparents, great-grandparents, many of them, they did not have ice, freezer chests. They wouldn't have had a freezer in their basement or, in their kitchen, a box freezer or anything like that on their back porch. How did they keep things going? They canned. This is not that difficult to figure out. And yet we have, it's not just the denominational world, but even some of our own brethren want to start trying to argue from this position as though these people in the Bible are just a bunch of big dummies. They're not. They are involved in great accomplishments, and this is the line of Cain. These are individuals that walked away from God, and yet these are the things that they are able to accomplish. So the very argument of, there's no refrigeration, how would they do it? Friends, brethren, they knew how to do it. If you can preserve meat, you can preserve grapes. And if you can preserve preserve meats, then for sure you're going to be able to preserve grape juice. And here's some more source material for you. From the Journal of the Adventist Theological Society, I recognize this is coming from the Seventh-day Adventists. I do not agree with everything that they promote, all their doctrinal positions. But when it comes to this information, the Bible Alcoholic Beverages by Samuel, if you want to pronounce that last name, I'm happy to let you do it. This is some good source material. He cites his sources to where you don't just simply have to take his word for it. He gives you the books where he finds his material. You can then go dig into those books for yourselves and find out, is he quoting this correctly? Is this actually what the author is saying? And so I would highly recommend that if you are an individual that is trying to promote what the Bible teaches on alcohol and its consumption that is in fact sinful, this is some material that you need to have in your arsenal. So when it comes to the preservation of grapes or grape juice, starting on page 185, a major objection against the view that Scripture approves the use of unfermented grape juice is the alleged impossibility in Bible times of preserving grape juice unfermented. And that's all it is. It's an alleged impossibility. It's an assertion. Well, we don't know that they were able to do it. If you can look back just a couple hundred years and see your grandparents, great-grandparents, and they're able to preserve things, where do you think that came from? So I've already touched on that. To test the validity of this popular assumption, I investigated the testimonies of ancient writers regarding the art of preserving fruits and wines in general and grape juice in particular. To my surprise, I discovered that the ancients were far more acknowledgeable in the art of preserving fruits and wines than is generally believed. So here's the section on fermented wine. Contrary to popular opinion, the problems the ancients encountered in preserving fermented wine were as great as, if not actually greater than, those faced in preserving unfermented grape juice. What's he just said right there? In the ancient world, it was harder to preserve alcoholic wine than it was to actually preserve simple, plain grape juice. To prevent fermented wine from becoming acid, moldy, or foul-smelling, vintners use a host of preservatives such as salt, seawater, liquid, or solid pitch, boiled down must, marble dust, lime, sulfur fumes, or crushed irises. Now, I don't know about you, but having boiled down must and marble dust put into my wine just so it's able to smell good does not sound that enticing to me. I would just much rather stay away from that and just give me the simple grape juice. Marcus Porcius Cato, 234 to 150 BC, so that's before the time of Christ, who is considered the father of both Latin prose and literature on agriculture, refers to the use of some of these preservatives, saying, if necessary, add to the new wine a 40th part of must boiled down from untrod grapes, or a pound and a half of salt to the culeus, a liquid measure. If you use marble dust, add 1 pound to the culeus, mix this with must in a vessel, and then pour into the jar. If you use resin, Pulverize it thoroughly, 3 pounds to the culleus of must. Place it in a basket and suspend it in the jar of must. Shake the basket often so that the resin may dissolve. When you use boiled must or marble dust or resin, stir frequently for 20 days and press down daily. So that's your fermented wine and being able to properly preserve it. Now notice this section on unfermented grape juice, just simple grape juice. In comparison to fermented wine, the preserving grape juice from becoming fermented was a relatively simpler process. Ancient sources inform us that it was accomplished in 4 main ways. Number 1, by boiling down the juice to a syrup. Number 2, by separating the fermentable pulp from the juice of the grape by means of filtration. So that's what, going back to point number 2, the argument that's used is, well, fermented grape juice alone by itself can end up being fermented without adding anything to it. Yes, that's true. And guess what? All you have to do is take away the pulp, filter it, strain it, and you resolve that issue. Number 3, by placing the freshly pressed grape juice in sealed jars which were immersed in a pool of cold water. So even back during the biblical times, here's refrigeration. By fumigating the wine jars with sulfur before sealing them. Caveman, a renowned agriculturist who lived in the 1st century AD, discusses at great length the different methods used to preserve unfermented grape juice. And speaking of its preservation by boiling, he writes, quote, some people put the must in leaden vessels and by boiling reduce it by 1/4, others by 1/3, end quote. He goes on to explain that, quote, afterwards, when it has cooled, you should pour it into vessels, cover it, and seal it up. In this way, it will keep longer and no harm will befall it. And you see these little numbers right here after these quotes. It's either at the bottom of the page in the footnotes, or you go back to the very back of the book where you have the index and you look for number 18, and that'll tell you the book where he's getting his information. So as I said, he cites his sources. The custom of preserving grape juice by boiling it down into a syrup has survived through the centuries in the Near East and Mediterranean countries. This beverage is known as vino cotto, boiled wine in Italian, if you want to try to pronounce that, in French, and it has all these different names in these different languages. There are indications that the ancient Jews preserved wine by boiling it. John Keto Encyclopedia of Biblical Literature says, quote, the Mishnah states that the Jews were in the habit of using boiled wine. Quote, they do not boil the wine of the heave offering because it diminishes it and consequently thickens it, thus rendering the mingling of water with it when drunk necessary. But it is immediately added. Rabbi Yehuda permits this because it improves it. And there is your source to where you can go and find this. The fact that the Old and New Testament do not discuss the art of preserving grape juice does not mean that it was unknown in Bible times. And so that's what people are trying to argue from. They're trying to argue from the position of ignorance and silence of the scriptures. Well, it's not in there, so therefore they must not have known how to do it. Wrong. So wrong. The Jews were not less knowledgeable in the art of preservation than the surrounding nations. Josephus tells us that the Romans were astonished to find in the fortress of Masada wine, oil, fruits, and cereals freshly preserved, although they had been stored for several years. Furthermore, rabbinical sources specifically mention the use of boiled wine. The reason for the silence of the scripture on the means used for preserving grape juice is to be found in the nature of the Bible itself, a book which deals primarily with those aspects of life which are related to salvation history. And that's exactly right. The Bible is not a full-out explanation of all of human history. The Bible is designed to show to us the track of salvation from Adam through Noah to Abraham, the law of Moses, up until the time of Christ. That's what the Bible is designed to do. So to try to go to the Bible and say, well, there's nothing in there being recorded about them preserving grape juice, so therefore they must not have known it. That's faulty reasoning. You can't argue that way. In the Bible, we find no treatise on agriculture as among classical writers. The reason is not a lack of interest in or a lack of knowledge of farming, but a reluctance to deal with issues unrelated to religious life of God's people. We have reason to believe that the Jews knew some of the methods of preservation known and used in the ancient world. And of course they would have. If our ancestors in this country know how to preserve meats, fruits, vegetables, eggs, then you can rest assured that those in the Bible time knew how to do it as well. Thus, moving on to arguments 3 and 4 now become useless. Therefore, it could be used at the Passover meal. No, it could not. they would have known how to preserve it and keep unfermented wine from taking place and being used. And thus, it would not be used at the Lord's Supper either. Because, friends, you cannot simply just start breaking God's commands by weak excuses. And that's what we have people doing. People are trying to make excuses, and ultimately they're trying to say, well, God really didn't mean what he said. Well, what did God have to say when it came to the Passover? Exodus chapter 12, beginning in verse 14. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. Even the first day ye shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. So again, when it comes to the bread aspect, you have no issue with that. Well, yeah, unleavened bread. Well, then, if it's the case for unleavened bread, why would it not be just as serious when it comes to the grape juice? And it is going to be just as serious. So notice here, it says it's not to be found in your house. You put out all leaven from your house. Well, what if you had some grape juice and you've had it for a while and, hey, you open it and, okay, it's smelling like it's starting to go. Are you just simply going to use it? Well, we'll just go ahead and use it. No, you go out, you gather more grapes, you make fresh grape juice. It's that simple. And I know it's that simple because we actually have brethren right now in Ukraine that they have to do this very process. They cannot buy grape juice like we have. If they do try to buy grape juice, it's usually mixed with some other juice, grape and apple, cranberry, and so on and so forth. They have a very hard time finding just simple grape juice. Guess what they do? They grow their own grapes. They grow their own grapes, and they squeeze out their own juice. And they use that on the Lord's Supper every first day of the week. It's not that hard. So to act like back here in the Bible times, it just would have been impossible for them to do this. That's a very weak argument. And you're not giving these individuals the right amount of credit as they deserve. If it's found in your house, if you're eating it, you're cut off from Israel. Verse 16, in the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and the seventh day there shall be an holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save to that which every man must eat. That only may be done of you. And ye shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. Verse 18. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at even, ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at even. 7 days shall there be no leaven found in your house. So there it is said twice. No leaven found in your house. What's that going to include? That's going to include your grape juice. No leaven found in your house, for whosoever eateth that which is leaven, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he be a stranger or born in the land. So it's not just a children of Israel thing. Even if you have strangers that have come in and they're following you, this applies to them as well. You shall eat nothing leavened. In all your habitation shall you eat unleavened bread. Guess what? Nothing. Ye shall eat nothing leavened. That includes your grape juice. You're going to have to get rid of that. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 1. In the retelling of the law, Moses takes it, I say Moses, but God takes it a step further. Observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib, the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. Thou shalt therefore sacrifice the Passover unto the Lord thy God of the flock and the herd in the place which the Lord shall choose to place his name there. Thou shalt eat no leavened bread with it. 7 days shalt thou eat unleavened bread therewith, even the bread of affliction, for thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt in haste. That thou mayest remember the day when thou camest forth out of the land of Egypt all the days of thy life. There shall be no leavened bread seen with thee in all, notice this, in all thy coast. 7 days. So in Exodus, it says it's not to be found in your house, and it said it twice. Now, in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 4, you're not even supposed to find leaven in all of the coast. In all of your borders. Nowhere in Palestine, nowhere in Israel was there to be found leaven. You cast it out. Neither shall there anything of the flesh which thou sacrificest the first day at even remain all night until the morning. It's that simple. It's that easy. Would it have been used in the Passover? No. There's absolutely no leaven. What about our grape juice? No. You throw that out, you make fresh. It's not difficult. what do we have taking place? People just simply trying to make excuses. And ultimately what that is people doubting God. Well, God really didn't mean what he said. Are we really going to start playing that game? God really did not mean what he said? If God said no leaven, then that means no leaven. And what we have going on today is people lack conviction. People are just lazy when it comes to what God says to do. To where they think, well, this is really way too hard for us to accomplish. Not in our day and age. It is far too easy for us. And therein lies the problem. Things are way too easy. To where now we start looking at what God says to do, and we start seeing that as a hindrance. Well, that's too burdensome. That's too grievous. Seems like I read in a book somewhere that God's laws, God's commandments are not grievous. But yet this is how people treat them. And when I hear people arguing this way, even some of my own brethren, when I hear my brethren arguing from the position of, well, they didn't have refrigeration, so it would have been hard for them to preserve it. You are weakening the position of God. You're not having the proper respect and admiration for what God has said. And it's probably because they're guilty of this. They are out there drinking. They are out there consuming alcoholic wine. So what do they have to do? They have to try to find some loophole, some excuse, so they can keep doing it. But it's not here. They would have been able to preserve it. They would have been able to keep it. And thus, there's no excuse for us today. And the real shame, the real sad part about this, as I'm mentioning, our brethren are involved in this too. Bear Valley Bible Institute down there in Colorado. They are promoting this idea that, well, if you're over in a foreign land, if you're over in Europe and something like that, and they use alcoholic wine for their Lord's Supper, then fine, you can do that. Or if you cannot find grape juice, then yeah, you can substitute alcoholic wine for the Lord's Supper. How do I know this to be the case? I was just talking to an elder from Texas just the other day. I think it was just yesterday. He's been in touch with some brethren in Ukraine, trying to give them help. And the brethren in Ukraine have been expressing how just some of the troubles that they've faced throughout the years, and how that they've not been able to buy just simple grape juice. And yet they've run into some individuals from the Bear Valley Bible Institute. And those preachers coming out of that school have told them, well, if you can't find that, then just, use a little bit of alcoholic wine for the Lord's Supper table. Friends, brethren, that's false doctrine. That is ignoring what God has said. In Jesus, in setting up the Lord's Supper, it was during the Passover. So there would have been no leaven in the house at all for Jesus to then say, this is what you're supposed to do. Unleavened bread, fruit of the vine. When he says fruit of the vine, he means fruit of the vine, grape juice. And as I've already mentioned, what are our brethren in Ukraine doing? They're making their own grape juice. You see, they're not giving in. They're not making excuses. This is what God has said. We're going to do it. That's conviction. That's dedication. But yet, what do we see coming out of our Bible institutes? It's not really what God meant. And it's not just Bear Valley Bible Institute. It's Freed Hardeman as well. You head over to the Freed Hardeman website, and you search Freed Hardeman Lectures 2018. One of the links will take you to their website where you can find past recordings of their lectures. You go to 2018 lectureship audio recordings. You click that, and you scroll down, and you're going to find episode or recording 65, which is Wednesday at 8:30 a.m., Understanding the Text by Earl Edwards. In this lecture, Earl Edwards, who is an elder in the Lord's church, says, it's almost like in the first 5 minutes, Earl Edwards says he cannot condemn a brother or sister that wants to casually drink in their home. And then he even goes further to make the same type of argument that the Bear Valley Institute is making. Well, if you're over in Europe, there are certain countries that they don't have grape juice, and all they have is alcoholic wine. And what are you supposed to do then? And these are supposed to be the top tier of our brotherhood elite. And what are they doing? They're making excuses, just like everybody else. And why would they be doing that? Because more and more people are getting involved in this sin. And guess what? If we cannot get people to convert, if we cannot get people to stop doing this, then what's that going to do to our attendance? What's that going to do to our influence? People are going to stop coming. This is the Finger Church of Christ, where Earl Edwards is an elder. And I just have this here because I don't want anybody to think, well, Earl Edwards is just some random guy that they had to come in, or some random gospel preacher that they had to come in and present a lecture. No. Earl Edwards has preached at Finger and served FHU as a faculty member for many years. He was on the faculty. The Finger Church of Christ is right there in Henderson, where Freed Hardeman is. He still presents lectures. He was a former faculty member. He's an elder inside of the Lord's church, and that's what he's promoting. Friends, brethren, we have got to stand against this. The Bible's very clear on it. Don't even look at it. Don't go towards it. It's not for kings. It's not for priests. We are to be sober-minded. When it comes to the Lord's Supper, there's no room for alcoholic wine there on the table. And we do not need to start looking at these individuals and using these weak arguments, as though they are dumb cavemen and they do not know what they're doing. They knew what they were doing. They had every opportunity, every ability to preserve the grape juice as it was. So friends, brethren, we just simply are without excuse. And we are wanting to teach properly individuals what the Bible says, removing these false and weak arguments so that we can not only have the church be stronger, but so that we can help our communities. If you remember, all of this started because, episode 17, where we're dealing with St. Patrick's Day. And our local community is advertising for St. Patrick's Day. Come and celebrate blarney and debauchery. That's where our community is. And the only way to change that is for the church to stand up and to present what the Bible actually says on these issues. So we're trying to help people get back to the Bible on this issue of wine, properly understanding it from scriptures, how the Bible condemns it, and so that people can stay away from it. We appreciate you for being with us today. And as we go out, we want to make sure that we tell you about our other avenues where you can follow us. Be sure to follow the Church of Christ of Lake County YouTube channel. Subscribe to that. We upload our Bible classes and our sermons that are streamed live on our Facebook page. Be sure to check out the Instagram page, Back to the Bible Broadcast, where we put up some, we're just kind of memeing around with what we're doing. Our contact information, cfcoflakecounty@gmail.com. My cell phone number, 434-429-5221. Of course, you can message us on Facebook. Be sure to follow the Back to the Bible broadcast on YouTube. Subscribe, hit the notification bell. We will be live Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And this coming Sunday, just to give you an idea of what we are looking at doing, we are coming up on episode 20. And we're wanting to do something pretty big for that episode. And we're going to be dealing with some material from a local church here in Polson, Montana, the Foursquare Church in Polson, and a video that they posted about the Holy Spirit and indwelling. And we've already done a great deal. I say a great deal, maybe 3 episodes on the Holy Spirit, but it's one of those topics that's just never going to go away and it's constantly being abused. So we hope that you'll tune in this Sunday at 7:30 for that episode. For those that are local here in the Lake County area of Montana, you're invited to come out and assemble with us. We are at the VFW Hall at 35981 Round Butte Road West here in Ronan, Montana. Every Sunday, Bible class starts at 10 a.m. and our worship assembly follows thereafter. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 7 for our Bible class and for our sermon time, and that should be able to help us to finish the chapter to where we'll be able to move on to chapter 8 at the appropriate time. So we invite you to come out and be with us, bring your questions if you have those. But of course, you can leave your billfold at home because we're not going to be asking for any money. And as we mentioned, the church does have a Facebook page, Church of Christ of Lake County on Facebook. Our Sunday sermons are live streamed, and we do different posting there as well. That's kind of separate from the Instagram page, and that's kind of separate from the YouTube page. So we're trying to cover as many bases as we can without getting overwhelmed. And we invite you to follow all of these, like all of these. And if you want to reach out to us through these means of social media, we invite you to do that. So that's all we have today for our leftovers. We thank you for being with us. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us. And until next time, we hope that you have a great rest of your day, and God bless.